Overthrowing North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un will unleash war, ex-US officials warns. In the wake of North Korea's most recent missile test, world leaders are attempting to combat Pyongyang's repeated threats. But two former US officials have suggested toppling Kim Jong-un might not be a wise idea. Richard Sokolsky, who served in the U.S. State Department for 37 years, and Aaron David Miller, who was a Middle East negotiator in both Democratic and Republican administrations, have warned against attempting to remove the North Korea dictator. Writing for North Korean watchdog 38 North, the pair said, with little or no understanding of internal power dynamics or personalities, any plan for a coup de main is unlikely to survive initial contact with the enemy. Decapitation, if it means military strikes against Kim and other leadership targets, would almost certainly unleash North Korean military retaliation against South Korea and U.S. forces stationed there, significantly escalating the risk of a wider conflict and also the unsettling prospects of loose North Korean nukes. Mr. Sokolsky and Mr. Miller warn the collapse of Kim Jong-un's regime could spark a refugee crisis on the Korean peninsula and have far-reaching consequences for the region. They said, while the urge to rid the world of the regime is understandable, the risks, costs and consequences of acting on this impulse are rarely considered. While much of the discussion of a North Korean regime collapse focuses on its potential to unleash thousands of refugees to China and South Korea and on the enormous economic costs of Korean reunification, the geopolitical and security dangers would be far more consequential for the United States and its South Korean and Japanese allies and for the future stability of Northeast Asia. Mr. Sokolsky and Mr. Miller point to previous U.S. interventions in other countries, such as Iran, Chile and Iraq, and say replacing Kim Jong-un is by no means guaranteed to improve the situation. They also suggest it is unlikely China would support a move to dispose of the North Korean leader. The former U.S. officials said, there is no reason to think a replacement would be easier to work with, it could easily be worse, more virulently anti-American, more prone to provocative action and less adept than Kim Jong-un has been so far at dancing on the cliff's edge. In fact, in most historical cases of regime change, the relationship between the intervening country and the new regime does not improve. There are also concerns that decapitation or an internal coup would also substantially increase the risk of proliferation and use of nuclear, biological or chemical weapons, NBC, weapons or material, and the possibility of a missile strike that could engulf the entire region is something that must be avoided. Meanwhile, any suggestion of U.S. plans for a regime change is likely to make the North even more hostile towards its enemies. Mr. Sokolsky and Mr. Miller write, every time a senior U.S. government official publicly declares a goal of regime change, it merely feeds the North's paranoia and reinforces its conviction that it must cling for dear life to its nuclear weapons. In fact, North Koreans believe that in the case of Iraq and Libya, both Hussein and Gaddafi would still be around if they would have had nuclear weapons at the time the United States toppled their regimes. Trying to topple Kim Jong-un would very probably precipitate a real crisis even worse than the current one. The cruel anomaly of carrying out a coup against North Korea, or taking any action that would set in motion a chain of events that could ultimately result in regime change, could just make an already bad situation a good deal worse whether we succeed or fail. It comes as CIA Director Mike Pompeo said he and other senior officials were ordered by President Trump to find a way to separate the North Korean regime from its missiles and nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Vice President Mike Pence confirmed all options are on the table in countering the North Korean threat, but his colleague Secretary of State Rex Tillerson rejected any calls for regime change. Only yesterday, Mr. Tillerson declared, "We do not seek a regime change, we do not seek a collapse of the regime, we do not seek an accelerated reunification of the peninsula, we do not seek an excuse to send our military north of the 38th parallel."